I really enjoy going to 0 to 1. I feel like there's the most contribution from my experience and learning. I learn the most in return selfishly.
Whoever client one is not who you're going to be long term. And so inevitably you have to break up with them later when you figure out what your product actually solves versus what you thought it was going to solve.
When I say 0 to 1, I really mean like 0 to 10 million in revenue, right? Like that segment or that phase is the hardest.
Welcome to Money Mavericks, the podcast where we explore the dynamic world of finance, investment, and entrepreneurship.
I'm Kirk Drake.
And I'm Daryl Hicks. Together, we're here to bring you the latest insights, expert opinions from the trailblazers who are redefining success in the financial world. Mr. Code, super excited to have you in here and joining us. Welcome to the Money Mavericks podcast, my friend.
Good morning. Thanks for having me. Most people start out with, is Code your real name?
Were your parents hippies?
Yeah, one would think. No, it was actually the last name of the guy who introduced my parents to each other, and my mom stuck me with it. So I became a VC as a result because, it made sense.
It's kind of the perfect name for a venture capitalist who specializes in investing in early stage technology companies. Having a first name like Code kind of makes a lot of sense.
Was the guy's first name Zip?
No. Secret.
We're going to have a lot of fun stuff to talk about. I've really enjoyed the friendship that we've built over a few years, Code, and I've come to really respect your advice and insights on the whole wonderful world of venture capital and early stage investment. I'm sure there's a lot of listeners out here that will glean some really great insights on raising capital for early stage businesses and how all that works. You and I have jammed on that before, but I'd love to start with understanding how in the world a venture capitalist, former COO of a really great technology company, ends up on the board of an airport in the city where you're based. Can you walk me through that a little bit?
So I'm no longer on that board, retired or was pushed out, I guess I'd say about 2 months ago, but I was on the board of the Ottawa International Airport, and I was chair actually for the last 5 years. It really started with, airports in Canada are partnerships. They're not run by the Fed. They're not private like in other countries. So the boards are managed by, I think there's 14 or 15 board members who are citizens at large and nominated by different bodies, whether it's the airline regulator, the city, chambers of commerce, etc. And so I joined as a bit of a contribute to the community starting point. And then ultimately I describe it as my grown-up board. So I sit on probably a dozen startup boards. And as you know, Daryl, it's a lot like meatball surgery. It's chaotic and crazy, and you're weeks away from, running out of cash. The airports have the unfettered ability to charge whatever they want for airplanes to land, and people always have to fly. It's a very different business model. It's much more governance driven. I've learned a ton being on that board, just about what it is like to have your nose in and your fingers out. Great experience.
That's fantastic. I had no idea that airports were able to charge whatever they want to for planes and land. I guess it's just the upper bounds of what the market will tolerate is the way that they work it.
That's right. And ultimately, airports serve the community. Like that is your constituent. That is your stakeholder. Primarily is the community you serve. So there's a limit that you can charge because you'll have reputational risk. And obviously the airlines have a huge lobby in Canada specifically. And so they'll push back hard too. So there is a limit. There are bounds. But during COVID, for example, when airlines lost 95% of their revenue in the span of 5 days, we ultimately had to increase rates to offset some of the cost because the airport still had to run all through COVID. Lights were on, but nobody was coming.
That was where I wanted to go with that. You were actually sitting on the board through the entire pandemic, and you're talking about airports as being this like super reliable, charge whatever you want, stable kind of model. I don't think that was really the picture during, especially in Canada, when the lockdowns were severe and quite protracted.
Well, a random question actually. In the US, the airports are funded, I believe, by a percentage tacked on to each ticket. And so if no tickets are being sold, then I imagine that has some sort of revenue impact. Is that true in Canada too?
Yeah, I'll answer that first. So the revenue comes from a combination of really three things. There's concessions. So it's a bus station with a shopping mall attached, right? And so you get rent from all of the concessions that live in the airport. You also get fees for airplanes landing and taking off. So a per seat fee and a landing fee from the airlines themselves. And then in Canada, there's a fee called the AIF, Airport Improvement Fee, which is about a third of the revenue, plus or minus. And that is a tack on, if you will, to tickets. And obviously that disappeared. And when airlines aren't landing, you're losing that revenue. And of course, if there's no one at the airport, you're losing that revenue. I was chair actually through COVID. We went through, 95% revenue reduction, as I mentioned. And you still have to house and feed and keep the lights on, et cetera, et cetera. So we went massively in the red for the first time ever. And the watchword for those couple of years with the CEO, Mark LaRoche, and I was, financial stability. That was everything we cared about. So we paused all hiring, obviously. We cut salaries, paused salary raises and increases, et cetera, and made sure we were viable. And we actually got back into the black within about 18 months. So it was an impressive job, not by me, but by the team at the airport.
That's incredible. And I remember too, like the snapback, because then of course there's all this pent up demand. And when the restrictions lifted in Canada, again, there was a softening in the United States, but in Canada, I think a lot of people don't realize how stark it was. Like the lockdowns were very severe, very dramatic. Canada was particularly affected by the pandemic because the hospitals were already stretched to the absolute limit in most provinces and had no flex capacity for any kind of like adverse event like that. But then conversely, when the restrictions are lifted, how do you staff and support this huge influx? And because these are heavily regulated entities and security is the thing. Like I had a friend who worked really closely with the Vancouver airport, and they're saying it was 90 days to get someone vetted and through security with their badge issued to them with the hologram and everything that's on it, background checks and other things like that. So there was airlines who were paying a $40,000 signing bonus to somebody that was only earning $60,000 a year as a baggage handler or a gate agent or whatever. An airline would say, I'll pay you for one time $40,000 signing bonus if you switch from that airline over to my airline because I'm just so desperate for people. Did you see any of that kind of happening?
Oh, it was nuts. It was no question about it. I mean, when people were furloughed, they had to eat. So they went and found other jobs that they could do remotely. And as you say, the rate card, your ID card does take months because you have to do a full background screen, as one would expect. And so we had, executives handling the baggage lines. We did what we had to do to get through. I remember a CEO, I can remember, I think it was a Toronto CEO, said at the time, it's easy to shut off an airport. It's really hard to turn it back on, right? All those planes are furloughed, the people are furloughed, the systems have to get retested, et cetera, because obviously you can't have a mistake happen and no new learning curves are allowed. So it was pretty chaotic for quite a while there. But, in Canada, I think I coined the term, and I don't know that if I can take credit for it, but the idea of revenge travel actually came on first, long before any business travel even started to come back. And we predicted that, and that certainly saved a lot of airlines and airports coming out of COVID because people were just so tired of being pent up, cooped up in their apartments and houses. So they started traveling again en masse. And it was a very different shift. In fact, that shift is alive and well today where airlines predominantly like 80% of their margin comes from business travelers. And that's no longer the case when you can do things like this on Zoom. And now you're really relying on consumers who are cheap as chips, not surprisingly. And so the whole airline industry has to get retooled and rebuilt with an entirely new business model, which is really fascinating to watch.
Oh, my word. I love this idea, this mental picture of executives at the airport doing baggage handling.
Slinging bags.
Yeah. Now that does sound like a startup, actually. That sounds exactly like a startup.
Yeah.
All hands on deck. I think there's probably a lot more analogy in there than maybe we'd first think, but it must have been a fascinating time going through all of that. And we could probably spend an hour just unpacking all of the amazing stories out of that, this one-off sort of pandemic. Maybe one last point. What came up for me as you were kind of sharing this is there was obviously a tremendous amount of rage and frustration and criticism. Everybody who started traveling when the airports were back on
baggage
were just raging about how everything was a gong show. And no one really understood. There was no empathy. There was no understanding. And I almost wish that there would have been more transparency around what was actually happening here so that because people can actually really understand and have some compassion and sympathy if the information is made available to them. But people just showed up at the airport. They had no idea what's been going on. They just assumed that everything would be back to normal naively. And
I don't
then
know. I look at like the CrowdStrike thing, and I don't think any U.S. consumers were empathetic towards United or Delta. On Money Mavericks, we don't just talk about making money. We explore the innovative strategies and bold decisions that drive real change. Whether you're an experienced investor, a budding entrepreneur, or just someone looking to make smarter financial choices, we've got something for you.
Every week, we're going to sit down with industry leaders, visionaries, and mavericks who share their journeys, challenges, and breakthroughs, from contrarian views on market trends to the secrets behind building a successful startup. You get an inside look at what it takes to thrive in today's economy.
And we promise to keep it real, engaging, and most importantly, actionable. No jargon, no fluff. Just straightforward conversations that you can apply to your own financial journey.
So get ready to challenge your thinking, expand your knowledge, and take control of your financial future. This is Money Mavericks,
where we turn financial dreams into realities and mavericks into legends.
There's two things there that are actually, I think, quite relevant. One is the fact that, over 20 or 30 years, the industry matured and became so tightly wired that there was no room for error, right? If you think about how impressive it is to fly across the country with zero delays and your baggage shows up at the right spot at the right time, that's an incredibly tightly orchestrated system of a lot of folks from end to end to make that happen. And so when all of a sudden you have 20, 30% less staff, you've got planes that haven't flown in months, et cetera, having that turn on and have, the average consumer go, okay, this is the way it's always been. And I expect to have the same expectations. It's just not going to happen. So it's going to be challenging. There's no doubt about it. The other thing I would say is that a lot of folks don't understand is that airports are decoupled from the services within. So airports have nothing to do with your baggage. For example, that's entirely run by the airline. So they contract out to a third party. Same as the food, same as the vending, same as the security. And yet the airport ends up getting labeled or libeled with all the issues. Oh, it's the airport. That's a terrible airport. Well, they literally have nothing to do about it. So it's communication is key. But people have busier things to worry about than, who manages their bags on their flight.
Yeah, exactly. So you're trying to tell me that it's not Pearson's fault that they're the worst airport in Canada?
I'm not going to judge, that's for sure. I don't get a residual here. But the one thing I'll mention, Darren, it's probably a good segue to startup land, is that, if you have the right leadership team, which I think we did at the Ottawa Airport, a very innovative, tech-savvy CEO who was willing to do experiments and challenge the status quo and add innovative things, like retinal scans, to cutting down security lines, like, drone awareness on the airport to increase security, like autonomous vehicles. The airport can be an interesting petri dish, if you will, of innovation and technology adoption, which is, a good segue into startups. So it doesn't have to be a staid old industry that doesn't innovate.
There's one final question, because I'm always fascinated by the number of trade associations that exist. I assume there is a trade association of like airport authority things. And
absolutely
have some conference where all the airport, expertise shows up in one place at one time, and then they take the one idea they had and replicate it, to 10,000 airports.
Yep. I'd say there's several. I think IATA, International Air Transport Authority or something like that, is the big one. I've been to some of those conferences. They're not nearly as fun as CES or the stuff we do in startup land, but it's well organized.
We could have a debate about which is more exciting and interesting, Airport Authority Trade Association Conference or the Credit Union Trade Association Conference.
What if it makes the world go around?
Two groups together, what would happen?
Amazing. So yeah, that probably is a great segue. I'm really excited for the meat of this conversation because you have a tremendous amount of experience, Code. It's not just the experience. I think it's the insights that you've gleaned along the way through investing in technology startups over your career. But maybe before we get into that, as by way of introduction, Kirk and I often like to kind of just get people's origin story. It's almost never a straight line from the lower left to the upper right, but it's fascinating to me to see, like, how in the world did you end up raising capital from LPs and investing into startups where you are now. Where did it all start and how did you end up there?
Well, just to be clear, we've had
Sure.
3 or 4 now that have some weird tie-in to the airline industry. Like, right?
Maybe there's something there.
There you go. I'll give you a somewhat abbreviated version and happy to poke in different areas, but you're right, definitely not a straight line. I mean, I think until I was, 30 years old, I'd never even heard of venture capital. So it was definitely an eye-opener for me. Let me start back at the beginning. So my undergrad is engineering, physics. I'm a math guy. I like hard technical things. I also like things that don't bleed or cry. So I was never meant for life sciences. And I like knowing answers. And I'm fundamentally addicted to learning and learning curves. And so ultimately, VC is like the perfect place for someone like me who, half an inch deep but miles wide and just constantly, washed in new challenges and learning curves. So after undergrad, I went to IBM, as all good, young engineers would do. I lasted about 2 years and candidly didn't enjoy it, mostly because, IBM's a very, very big shop. And as a junior, hungry young engineer, you don't get a lot of responsibility or challenge. And so I moved at that point actually to Baltimore, Maryland, and spent a chunk of time at a startup called Sienna. And so Sienna ultimately went public and it was a wild success and it was good for me personally, but I also was in charge of designing some cool stuff. So I ultimately became an RF designer, so radio frequency, high frequency design, and in telecom. And then in that process, got an MBA. And I actually had started down the route of a PhD in engineering. And I spent about 6 months in the lab on a problem that we were trying to solve for my day job. And it was a tricky sort of EMI interference, electromagnetic interference problem that literally took 6 months to solve. And when I came up for air and had solved it, I just thought, I don't want to spend my whole life doing these 6-month long problems. And so I went to business school. And candidly, while I was in undergrad, I had started 5 of my own companies. I did the student painting, I did a contracting company, I did a marketing company. So I had some interest in business and so on. But then I went to business school and really fell in love with sort of the challenge of non-linear, stochastic systems, right? So in business, it's about influence, it's about selling, it's about getting your ideas across. It's not in engineering, there's the right answer and there's a wrong answer. The light turns on or it doesn't. And it was in business school that we had a guest lecturer in one day who was a VC, and he basically just said what he did. And I fell in love like instantaneously and said, oh my gosh, that's what I got to do. And so that was like this pivotal moment where you get to talk to companies every day with new ideas and the smartest, most innovative people in the world. And they talk to you and tell you everything about their business. Like, who wouldn't love that idea? And so not long after I joined the company I was with at Sienna, they started a corporate development group doing M&A. And they also started a seed fund, or an early stage fund, I guess you'd say, with $100 million. This is back in the late 90s. Happy to say that I helped them lose almost all 100 million because of the telecom crash, but learned a lot in the process on somebody else's dime, and worked my way up from, analyst, doing spreadsheets to doing term sheets. So I left there and I went to an institutional firm in California, sort of the NFL of VC, and spent a number of years in California as a VC. So worked my way up from associate to partner, and ultimately landed at Motorola. So I was running their venture program in the Bay Area, and which was great. And for 2 reasons, primarily. One was we only had one LP. And so we were spending $150 million a year on cool gear that, was everything Motorola at the time. We're talking cellular phones, set-top boxes, radios, everything, which was everything that I enjoyed. And then the other thing was that I could get into deals that I wouldn't have otherwise been able to get into, right? So venture capital is very much a network business, and you need to bring something unique to the table. And so I was bringing this business card of Motorola, which was, honestly, probably the second most active VC in the world at the time, next to Intel. And so that was terrific. So got into a lot of good deals, met a lot of good people, learned a lot. And then in 08, 09, the crash happened, and Motorola essentially sidelined that part of the business. Basically venture has a 10-year feedback loop. Corporations that are publicly traded have a 90-day feedback loop. And when you're spending $100 million a year and you're going through a recession, there's a lot of pressure on the leadership to question those dollars spent. So long story short, I left Motorola and I went to a startup that I had funded, and I ran it as the COO. And it was a remote physiological monitoring company, basically a wearable device company called Zephyr. And ultimately we sold that business to Covidian. So now it's a healthcare company within Medtronic, actually, ultimately. And then I sailed around the world for a year and a half. So I took a sabbatical. I convinced my wife to throw everything to the wind and sailed across the Atlantic and spent a year sailing around the Med with my two young boys. At the time, they were 10 and 6. And absolutely loved it. And it was just amazing, right? We were in, 18 countries in over 18 months and homeschooled the kids and, traveled and soaked up as much culture and history as we could. And that was a super formative experience. Highly recommended.
You know how many people talk about doing stuff like that and
Yeah.
never actually do it?
Yeah.
Like, I'd love to understand and I know there's more to the story because you're about to get to starting your own VC firm and raising money from LPs. And there's some interesting stuff to unpack in there, but I just would love if we could pause for a minute. Where were you when you decided, okay, we're just going to take the kids out of school, homeschool them, throw everything on a sailboat and start sailing across the Atlantic? For those of you listening who don't know, this is like one of the most gnarly crossings that you can have. It's inevitable that everybody on the boat is going to be puking at some point. Just where were you physically located and when you made this decision? And then what did that conversation look like?
The puking part is real, and myself included. I think it took me 6 or 7 days to get over the seasickness. I actually started many, many years before. I'm a big fan of putting thoughts into the universe and having the universe conspire to grant you your wishes. And so when I was in my early 20s, I had charted a big chunk of my life. My wife and I do this regularly. We'll take a 5-year, 10-year, 20-year horizon and go, okay, what would we like to look back on and having done, and what would need to be true to make that happen? And when I was in my early 20s, I had started to think about a sabbatical when I turned 40. And that was part of the deal, was we were going to work really hard until I turned 40. And then we were going to do something wild and crazy. And we were living in Annapolis in my late 20s, and we discovered sailing and got excited about it and started to learn that. And so that became part of that story. And then so for 10 years, I would talk about this trip we were going to take when I turned 40. And, when lo and behold, the company I was at was getting acquired, and the universe conspired and sort of provided the space and time for it to happen. And the seminal moment, though, to your point, was Christmas of 2011, I think it was. I was leaving the business, was getting acquired, et cetera. And my wife said, okay, you're turning 40 next summer. Shit or get off the pot, buddy. And so she called my bluff and I said, okay, fine, let's do it. So we went to a boat show in New York and I bought a very expensive radar, just a silly thing, but it sort of culminated like, okay, we're going to spend $5,000 on this. So therefore we have to do it. And then I spent a month preparing our boat. We had a small boat at the time and cast off in May because you cross eastbound in the spring and you go westbound in the fall. And so it just worked. And honestly, though, we didn't know if it would work in the grand scheme. It was one of two things. We were either going to be a very tight-knit family post-sailing, or we were going to get divorced somewhere in the mid-Atlantic, and that would be the end of it. Either way, it's going to improve things in the long term. Fortunately, it went the former, and we're now a sailing family. I've crossed the Atlantic several times.
And what's your average day look like?
On a crossing, it's actually really quite boring if you were to describe it, but at the same time, it's incredibly peaceful. I just crossed, 6 weeks ago on a race boat, and it was 4 hours on, 4 hours off. And when you're on, you're setting sails, you're sitting around, you're reading a book, you're getting something to eat, you're brushing your teeth. And when you're off, you're sleeping, you're doing a bit of email, whatever. But it becomes so regular and routine that it's very cathartic. It's very relaxing because you don't have to worry about anything except moving the boat forward. And
Right.
in so doing, it becomes extremely, you just de-stress. You completely de-stress. And when you hit the other side, you're a different person. So highly recommended.
Wow. This is something that I've heard from multiple friends of mine, all founders. I don't know, something about trailblazers and very courageous people are the ones who select to do this. There seems to be a strong, though not perfect, correlation. And they say a lot of the same thing, like it'll change your life. You won't be the same person on the other side of the crossing. And it becomes fairly addictive for the friends of mine who do this on a regular basis.
All true. How long does the journey take? Is it a week? Is it a month?
It depends on the boat. My first crossing was 45 days. So,
okay.
And the crossing we just did was 10 days. So my first crossing, we were doing 4 knots. Like it was an exciting 4 knots, which is about 5 miles an hour, 24 hours a day. You
not
don't
even
stop
sure if you're moving, right? Yeah.
Yeah, you just exactly. Sometimes the most recent boat I was on was a carbon fiber race boat that was extremely fast. We were doing 20 knots, much more exciting. It can be slow or it can be faster.
And did you have a captain on the boat with you when you went? Was it like, who was on the boat the first crossing, this 45-day crossing?
First time I was the skipper, and I had my VP of sales from the company that I had left, a good friend of mine from Washington, D.C., and my dad, and neither of those two had ever sailed before. And then a guy we picked up, I say on eBay, but he was on a listserv. We needed one more hand. And so he had applied and we took him on from Florida. So there ended up being, I think we dropped one guy in the Bahamas. And so it ended up being 4 of us crossing for the whole trip.
Is that the latest trip or the family trip?
That was the first one. So I picked up my wife and kids in Portugal.
You didn't take, they weren't with you.
No, my wife she would do it today. At the time, she wasn't quite as adventurous. So she said, I'll meet you there. And the kids were in school at the time, so it just sort of made sense.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out how I'd sell my wife on that.
Yeah, but then there was a period where like you were homeschooling the kids and you guys were, okay, maybe not transatlantic, but just sailing around the world, traveling on the boat. I remember when I was in my 20s, I was out on the West Coast in Vancouver Island. I was out on a trimaran. We were trolling for pink, and it was just a phenomenal time to be out there. And we ran into a family from France, super good looking, fit, husband was in his early 40s, wife was in her late 30s. They had 2 little kids, 9 and 7, a boy and a girl, and they were on a catamaran, and they had taken a year off for a sabbatical, and they'd taken the kids out of school. And he had, exited out of his business and had commissioned a boat to be built in Brazil, and then flew the whole family down to Brazil. And they were working their way up the West Coast of South America and then North America. And they were en route to Alaska. And we met up with them on this random small island off of the coast of Vancouver Island. And the boat was stunning and gorgeous. And one pontoon had 2 bedrooms for the kids, and the other pontoon had the master bedroom with the shower, and they had all Sub-Zero appliances and beautiful teak, flooring everywhere. I remember seeing this when I was in I think I was early 20s, 23, 24. And I was like, man, someday that's going to be
your
me.
ship will come in.
Yeah.
I will tell you, for my 2 boys who are now 22 and 18, it was my 22-year-old especially. I think it was the most impactful life event that they could have had. And what I mean by that is that they're much more self-reliant, independent, comfortable anywhere in the world. My youngest just came back from 4 months in Southeast Asia backpacking, and just super comfortable with everybody and challenging situations. So, I mean, my 10-year-old at the time was sitting watch in the middle of the night, sitting watch and responsible for the family's, well-being. So it takes you up a couple of notches in terms of learning curve and recognizing your value.
I think there's so many fascinating lessons to unpack on that, but we'll just sum it up by saying, good job, Dad. That's fantastic.
By the way, just to put it out there to everybody else, I don't think you necessarily have to sail. You can today get an Airbnb in Paris for 3 months and then do day trips, and it will rock your world. Right. And you can do that a month in Paris, a month in Germany and in England or something like that. These things are super doable, and it does expand your brain a lot. And honestly, I think the world would be a better place if we all spent more time getting to know the people in the other places.
Yeah, exactly. Creating more context and empathy and stuff like that, rather than living in our little epistemic bubbles or echo chambers online and things.
100%.
Fascinating.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of Money Mavericks. We hope you found it insightful and inspiring.
Don't forget to subscribe, like, and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. And be sure to share this episode with someone who needs to hear it.
Stay connected with us on social media and visit our website for exclusive resources, episode transcripts, and more.
Until next time, keep pushing the boundaries, making smart moves, and turning your financial dreams into realities.
You've been listening to Money Mavericks, where Mavericks become legends.